Welcome back, and we are just about ready to finish up our t-shirt quilt. This has been a great adventure for us, and we're happy to be able to give you some great information on techniques that make the process easier for you. The last piece that I want to talk about today is borders, and this is one of the most important parts of your quilt. What I see happen a lot of times with students and when we get quilts in to machine quilt for customers is blown out borders, because it just seems like we get the entire quilt done and we are tired and ready to be done with it. So we just slap the borders on, call it good, and hope that it all works out okay. And I would just encourage you that when your quilt top is done, before you put your borders on, just set it aside for a day, get a little bit of rest, and approach your borders and your binding as the most important part of the entire project. It's just like a painting. A painting is only as good as the frame that it's in. And your quilt is only as good as the borders that you put on it. You don't want them blown out. You don't want them to be on incorrectly. And you want to make sure that you have good cutting techniques for getting them prepped and ready to put on. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, in this situation with the quilt that we have behind us, it's a firefighting quilt. And I found some absolutely wonderful fabric that was made by Cycle Enterprises, a division of Fabrique Innovations Inc. And it's a beautiful pattern, and you'll notice when you look at it that it's directional. So we took this fabric and we needed to cut long strips for the borders and also long strips for the expansion joints. If you look behind here, you can see where we took out a 1.5 inch section right down the center. It just worked out that way. It was beautiful and added a nice accent to the middle part of the quilt. When you cut borders, what I like to do is I like to open up my fabric. So in this situation, we purchased 90 inches of fabric because we needed that much length for the sides. And then we purchased another yard of fabric to cut into 4 sections for the top and bottom of the quilt, because we need some of the fabric going side to side, and we need the majority of the fabric going lengthwise so that all of the firefighting and all the words are in the same direction. So when I cut long borders for the sides of the quilt, here's how I like to do it. I'll open up my fabric and I will fold it in half the long way. And the thing to notice, and one of the things that will help keep your quilt square with the borders, is if you cut on the outside edges. In this situation, we needed 8 inches of fabric for the outside border, but I left the selvage on. My rule of thumb with fabric is I never cut the selvage off unless there's a reason to. And in this situation, the selvage is going to help us because there's no stretch on this edge whatsoever. So I leave that in and I have it quilted with the selvage on, and then we square it up and cut the selvage off after it's been quilted. So in this situation, I have fabric that I need on the right side and I have fabric that I need on the left side. So I cut a strip 8.5 inches on this side with the selvage in, and then I flipped my fabric over and I cut 8.5 inches with selvage on this side. And those are the 2 pieces of fabric that are going to go on either side of the outside of my quilt. That way when it goes to the quilter, it has selvage on the right and it has selvage on the left, and it really helps stabilize your quilt. The one thing I want to put near and dear to your hearts is that you have to measure your quilt. You have to measure your quilt. You must measure your quilt. You cannot put borders on without measuring your quilt. And when I say measure, you're going to measure the full length of the left, the full length in the middle, and the full length on the right. And whatever that measurement is, if it's not all the same, you're going to take the average, and that's going to be the length of the borders that you put on. Another helpful hint on putting borders on is if your quilt, let's say your measurement is 90 inches, leave your quilt border 93 or 94 inches and pin it to the edge of your quilt with a little bit left on the top and a little bit left on the bottom. The reason I say this is because it's easier to square it up to the quilt after you've attached your binding than it is to cut your binding to what you think is the right length, and then after you've attached it and you press it out, it's not long enough. So always err on the side of caution, and if your measurement is 90 inches and your fabric is 94, then put pins at 90 inches plus the center, and you always, 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 always pin your borders to your quilt. Do not just throw it in your machine and assume that it's going to attach itself correctly to the border. What typically happens is the foot pushes and the feed dogs pull, and your borders will end up bigger than your quilt, and then you take it to your quilter and they can't get it flat on the quilt, and that's just not what you want to have happen. So it's really important that you measure your quilt, that you cut your fabric correctly and leave it longer than your quilt. You're going to pin, 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 measure, 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 pin, 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 sew, 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 press it out, and then square up the borders to the quilt. You'll be amazed at what a difference that makes. The other helpful hint is making sure that you leave selvage on the outside where you can, so that it adds a little stability to your borders, and then you can cut those off after it's been quilted. Thanks for letting me give you some helpful tips and hints. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and ring the bell so that you get notifications of our next video. We'll see you soon.